So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and I am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Dr. Andrew Roth, a scholar-in-residence at the Jefferson. Prior to joining our team at the Jefferson, Dr. Roth had an accomplished career in academia, from lecturing to leading. He taught taught various courses before going on to serve in administrations in Erie and to lead Notre Dame College in Cleveland as its president before retiring and becoming named President Emeritus. Failing at retirement, as he often puts it, he then went on to serve as interim president of St. Bonaventure University. Succeeding at failing again, he let us wrangle him into the Jefferson, where he's been facilitating the Rainey Fellowship Program and offering a wide range of lectures, from look at President Washington to Alexander Hamilton to the Jesuits to Lincoln to the American Tapestry Project. But notably, Dr. Ross has helped us rewind the clock 50 years, as he spent a year lecturing on 1968, the year, as many of us came to know, the year that America shattered, as Smithsonian Magazine declared and Dr. Roth often reminded us. But did it shatter? Dr. Roth offered 8 lectures at the Jefferson examining just that, and an additional 5 at the Chautauqua Institution, and 4 at the Siegel Institute at Case Western Reserve University, and numerous others. But was it the worst year in American history, post-Civil War? Or is 2020 perhaps the worst year in modern American history? That is the subject of the national correspondent for The Atlantic, James Fallows. He wrestles with that in his recent Ideas essay. Is this the worst year in modern American history? Comparing 2020 to 1968, offering some disquieting lessons for the present. And he did that for The Atlantic. No stranger to Erie, James, along with his wife, Deborah, have each presented at the Jefferson last in person at Global Summit 10, when they both received the Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award, and more recently for a digital conversation via Zoom, which is still available on the Jefferson's website. Now, when I saw Jim Fallows' examination of 1968 in light of today, I immediately sent an email to Andy. And after a brief back and forth, here we are today to discuss it. Fallows' treatment, Roth's review of 1968, and where that leaves us in 2020. What can the past teach us about the present as we lumber into the future? Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewer, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below, and we're going to do our best to get to those. If you're watching a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us the questions, and we'll get them along to Dr. Roth as best as we can. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please do visit our website at www.jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Dr. Andrew Roth, thank you for joining me for this discussion today.
Glad to be with you, Ben.
So, Andy, as noted in the intro, you're a prolific presenter at the Jefferson, but as of recently, with the shift from being able to gather in place, in person, we've moved to really ramping up our publications division. And you've turned into a prolific writer for us, churning out work on a weekly basis with your book notes. For those who haven't had a chance to follow along your work there, can you give us a quick overview? What inspired book notes, and what are you covering there?
Well, when we went virtual and a couple of presentations needed to be canceled or at least postponed until we can meet face-to-face again, Dr. Ferrati and I talked about different ways to continue to contribute to the Jefferson, and we landed on the idea of writing a weekly, it originally started out a weekly 500-word note on some book that I had been looking into, and it's of course turned out to be if brevity is the soul of wit, if brevity is the soul of wit, I'm potentially witless, because those 500 words have turned, I think, on average into 2,500 to 3,000. But I started out going over some of the books that are relevant to the American Story Project, the American Tapestry Project, and that are relevant to America in 1968. But as I moved along, I've reverted to the hidden English professor in me. You don't have to cut real deep to find a history professor or an English professor, and they sometimes fight with one another. But I do think they're actually compatible. And so we've also been exploring poetry such as Mary Oliver and Jack Gilbert, two of my favorites. And then it's related to the American Tapestry Project, a fairly long look at Whitman. And then just recently, inspired by some feedback and commentary from Chuck Joy, Erie's Poet Laureate, did a two-part series on Spoon River Anthology, which I was actually kind of very grateful to Chuck for having brought that to my attention. I hadn't literally read it in 50, maybe longer years. I mean, I vaguely remember reading it in high school and quite frankly not being impressed for some reason. But reading it again 3 times in about a week and a half period, I began to realize this is really kind of good. So that's where the book notes came from.
Well, I think one of the fun things that you've done is there's an absolute great read. I'd encourage all of those that you mentioned, but I also encourage you do a great look at high school reads, taking a look again at, and one of those happened to be Catcher in the Rye. And so I like this opportunity to go back and visit some works that perhaps we haven't sat with in quite some time to see how we look at them differently. And I thought that was a really great treatment too of Spoon River and your work there. Friendly reminder, folks, those are still all available on our website, jeserie.org. You can catch those there. But we're not here to talk all about just book notes. We're here to talk about 1968, something that you really focused a lot of attention on. And like I said, on Sunday, I got so excited when I read James Fallows' piece, and I wanted to email it to you, our resident scholar who's really turned his attention to that. So his piece, Is This the Worst Year in Modern American History? Comparing 2020 to 1968, offers some disquieting lessons for the present. I don't want to give it all away because for those who haven't had a chance to read that, I would really encourage you to check it out over on the Atlantic's website. But Andy, can you shed some light on what Fallows has to say about 1968, the year America shattered, compared to 2020, a year, well, a lot has been happening in these 5 months?
Well, I was really pleased to read it, and I think it's excellent and would recommend it to anyone. And perhaps unavoidably, we are going to steal a little of Jim's thunder here today, because there's really no way to talk about it without talking about it. But it was one of those things on a purely personal note where you kind of do this. I should have written that, because I go, wow. Okay, so, and that's no disrespect to him. I agree. I think it's a quality piece because I happen to agree with it and have said most, but not everything that he said on any number of occasions. And what he does is he rather meticulously and in very, very succinct fashion, meticulously does a comparison and contrast between 1968 and 2020. And then he draws two, I think, very, very important conclusions from that are worthy of a lot of thought and attention. One is very specific to our current political situation. The other is a little more general and ties into, for example, the other work that I help you with at the Jefferson, the Leadership Academy. And I don't believe Jim says this precisely in this way, but one of the interesting things about leadership is really important. Most people don't entirely believe that until they experience its absence. You'll see the comment anytime in the popular media about the guys in suits, and everybody thinks the boss doesn't know what he's doing. But usually that kind of talk, it's just the chatter, the noise in the background. But it really comes to focus how important it is whether or not the boss, the leader, knows what she's doing when it's clear that they don't. Either overtly they don't, they do the wrong things, or they're just absent.
Well, I want to get into the leadership because, again, a great area of your focus with the Jefferson team, facilitating the Ramey Fellowship program there. But let's do a side-by-side comparison, because when you give these presentations and take a look at 1968, whether it's individual episodes, which you have a great series, or you've managed to cram all of this into about an hour and give a quick speed overview of it. You use these headings to go through that. And, you mentioned two of them already, politics and leadership, and I want to get to those, but it's hard not to want to start with a big one right now for us in 2020, because we're feeling the weight of it, and that's pandemics. So comparing 1968 to 2020, let's talk about pandemics, because I think people might be surprised that that's something that the 2 years actually share.
Well, I have to confess, having spent what is it now, 2 or 3 years studying 1968. And in the interest of full disclosure, that's the year I graduated from college. So it's a year I have a little more than passing interest in. I mean, I lived through it. And so much for the eyewitness observer, having lived through it. I really was kind of not, I mean, one knew, and my contemporaries in the audience will understand what I mean, unless they were someone who was precociously and deeply involved in politics. You understood what was going on around you, but you didn't entirely grasp the, for lack of a better word or a more elegant word, the seriousness of it. But 1968 and 2020 have a lot in common, and they we're not even halfway through 2020, and chaotic, I think is a fair word, and 1968 was chaotic. And one of the things that happened in 68 that Jim reminded me of in his article, and you reminded me of, is there was a pandemic in 1968. And back to what I said, people didn't entirely notice it. The year was so chaotic, so violent, actually, and I mean violent, that actually the Hong Kong flu pandemic, which killed 100,000 Americans, was really background noise. No one really focused on that. And like COVID-19, in doing some quick research on it, and of course it primarily impacted the elderly, of whom I am now one, so I am acutely sensitive to that, but you know, it primarily impacted the elderly. So those of us embarking on our adult lives weren't as aware of it. And of course you had 100,000 dead in a year, and that kind of contextualizes COVID-19, where we've had somewhere around 105,000 documented. All best estimates suggest the number is really somewhere around 125, 130, maybe even a little higher, in what amounts to 3 months, March, April, and May. And so simple arithmetic interpolation forward, you get a big number that starts to flirt with the pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu. But right off the top, there's those two similarities. Some other similarities that Jim points out is, and dissimilarities, perhaps the biggest dissimilarity between 68 and 2020, and this might strike listeners as somewhat odd. We live in a, relatively speaking, peaceful time. While our military is deployed globally, and we are involved, and for anyone involved actually in it, I've had a nephew and other friends' children who served in Afghanistan. I do not mean in any way to diminish the seriousness of that if you are in harm's way, but we have a small war, if there is even such a, if that's even an acceptable phrase, in Afghanistan. But so far this year, and I looked it up, something like 2020, so far year to date, 9 Americans have been killed in Afghanistan. And if one of those happens to be a friend or relative, I understand that's World War IV. But in 1968, in the Vietnam War, in 1968 alone, 16,899 Americans, or roughly 46 per day, were killed in the war in Vietnam. And the overwhelming issue in 1968, which ultimately itself became overwhelmed, we'll come back to that, was the war in Vietnam. It was omnipresent, as was the anti-war movement. And part of that was, and another comparison contrast between 68 and now, that war in Afghanistan, which is going off somewhere here on the edges of our awareness. The reason it's on the edges of our awareness is there is no draft. We could go into a whole lot of analysis about why there is no draft. But one of the benefits to leaders, if you will, is the absence of a draft makes the military, makes going to war less urgent for the general populace because it's fought by all volunteers. Volunteers is an interesting word if the military is peopled disproportionately by people who think they don't have any other economic choices, but that would be another discussion. But in 1968, there was a draft, and possibly the best description of the emotional toll, I'm not even sure that toll's the right word, the emotional conflict that the draft created was in Lawrence O'Donnell's book, Playing with Fire, which is a very good and very recent recounting of the presidential election of 1968. In terms of book notes, by the way, as an aside, Ben, I've just discovered as getting ready for this and for perhaps an extra book notes on Jim's article. there really isn't any very good one-volume treatment of 1968. The last one was Charles Kaiser in 1988, which makes it 32 years out of date, and a whole lot of things have happened that changes the perspectives. There have been a number of other books, but there have been 3 or 4 really good books on the presidential election of 68. Theodore H. White's, of course, The Making of the President, 1968. It's the old war horse in that literature. But there's another one called American Melodrama by 3 Englishmen whose names are escaping me at the moment. And then O'Donnell's more recent book. And there's another one, the Election That Changed America. And again, the author's name is escaping me. So there's 3 or 4 really good books on the election. There's not a current, really prescient book on the overall cultural phenomena of 1968. So I don't know, maybe that's an opportunity for us at the Jefferson.
I was just going to say, you've assigned yourself some great homework there. That's the time to really do the book. So I think pointing out the wars, and particularly the draft, the difference there, you know, is an important note comparing then to now. And I think too, I can't help but think that, you know, a significant portion of my lifetime, we've been at war with Afghanistan. And so it's such an enduring war and such a lasting war that perhaps we don't think about it. It's not in the, you know, the frontal portion of our cultural awareness as much as Vietnam was, because it was much shorter lived than today's war.
Well, Vietnam went, well, it depends when you want to say it started, when it ended. I mean, we had a presence in Vietnam probably for as long ago as 1954, 55, and it didn't end, or the American involvement didn't really end until 73-ish, and then the last helicopter left Saigon in 75. But your point's well taken. The Afghan War is the longest war in American history. I mean, we are now at 19 years and counting, or approaching 19 years and counting. And one needs to ask ourselves why, but that would be another discussion. Another element that Jim points out that 2020 so far, knock on wood, is more peaceful than 1968 is there have not been any, and let's hope there aren't any, political assassinations. Whereas in 1968, there were 2. And then actually in the 1960s, there were 7, depending on whether or not we choose to include George Lincoln Rockwell. But in 1968, in April, I think actually it was April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and literally 2 months to the day later, Robert F. Kennedy was shot, although he did not actually die until the early morning hours, I believe, of June 5th, the next day. California primary was June 4th, but the difference in time he was shot, I think he died June 6th, because he did linger for about a day. Well, so far, we've not had political assassinations. So those are 3 things that aren't similar, but there are some things that are similar. And perhaps the most important one, and I think it's why you and I decided to do this today and why Jim's essay was so timely, is race relations. And everything that is exploding in America these last 7, 8 days, is just incredibly evocative of 1968, 1967, 68 to be a little more precise. 1968, one of the things in that summary presentation I say that's important, 1968 was the beginning of, perhaps retreat's too big a word, but de-emphasizing the movement towards Black civil rights. Lyndon Johnson's great accomplishments were the 3 great civil rights acts of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which ironically happened in 1968 in direct response to the assassination of Martin Luther King, when the Republicans in Congress agreed to it for fear that if they didn't, they would get an even more aggressive Fair Housing Act. But simultaneously with that is you begin to see the beginning of the retreat from it through Nixon's Southern strategy and the candidacy of George Wallace, and we'll come back to that. And so when you look at today, 52 years and counting on, they're not exactly the same issues, but the single most important, or one of the 3 most important issues, certainly one of the 2 most important issues in American history, the other being Native Americans and the plight of indigenous people, is of course the history of African Americans. And we still, 244 years on since the Declaration of Independence, 401 years after the first Africans debarked at Jamestown. We're still sorting that out in America. It is, some people would say it's America's original sin, which has yet to be expiated. And we're living that today.
And it's such a issue of the now that touches all of the country, you know, as we're seeing this unfold in real time. And I can't help but think that in context of some of the other points that you focused on in 1968, that's what makes us hyper aware of what's happening, because in 68, we have the Walter Cronkites of the world that we tune into at a particular time of the day, and we get our news in a consolidated amount of time, and we read papers, and that's it. That's all we have. And today, it's so much different with social media. And we're seeing even things not immune here in Erie, where footage from riots that have turned peaceful to violent being captured in real time with cell phones and then shared on social media and then just becoming viral on the internet. It's so hard to ignore the presence of that. And so as heavy as it is in 1968, I wonder, is it heavier now because we see so much more of it, and we see people reacting in real time and start drawing very real comparisons to what's happening in other cities and what's happening in ours?
Well, it's related. You're absolutely right, Ben. It's related to race relations. I mean, race relations in America is the issue that we need to heal, that we need to solve. And any therapist would tell you the first step you have to go through in order to come to terms with an issue is to, in fact, confront that issue, is to acknowledge it. So one of the things we have to do in American culture is stop 200 and some plus years of avoidance. Well, that's not even fair. The people who have avoided the issue someone once said, spare me the moderates, but the people who have avoided the issue are the bulk of what I'm going to call decent citizens who don't know how to deal with it, who are not inherently negative. But there are some people who, for better or worse, will deal with it overtly, and they tend to be on the wrong side of history. They don't know that, but they may not live long enough to figure that out. But so racists are not afraid to say what they think. But other people seem to be, for some reason, a little reluctant to call it out for what it is. But complicating it, as you just said, is the other phenomena. One of the characteristics I say that was really important about 1968 is I call it mediated America. It was the year America passed some cusp in its mediation, by which I do not mean negotiation. I mean the omnipresence of particularly electronic media. But that electronic media seems almost quaint now. I mean, there were three television stations, excuse me. If there had been three television sets, history would have been really different. Three television stations, channels. There was a thing called the fairness law in broadcasting, that if you said one thing, you had to give the opposite point of view a fair chance to air its position, which of course, one of the most important things that has happened recently is when the Fairness Act was negated. And there was a sense of serious responsibility on the part of the media. Does that mean they were all Burkean? No. But there was a sense that they had a public responsibility, particularly the three major networks who were hardly without blemishes or faults, but they had a real journalistic sense of integrity, as did most of the major and even local community newspapers. And what you don't have today is anyone of the stature, and Jim, I believe, has it in his essay. I talked about it, actually found the clip on the Library of Congress and played it for people, of Walter Cronkite's return from Vietnam and his report on the Vietnam War. And Walter Cronkite was the anchor for CBS News, and he was and had the reputation, and there was survey after survey to back it up, the most trusted man in America, Uncle Walter. And he came back from Vietnam and he made a presentation, tried to be as apolitical as he could, but he ended up by saying that it was his opinion that we were mired in stagnation. and in stalemate. Lyndon Johnson is alleged to have remarked when he heard that, he says, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the country. There's no one in all of media of Walter Cronkite's stature that all people from all points on the political spectrum would listen to him, not necessarily agree with him, but take what he had to say seriously. And if they disagreed, not bark and yell, but think seriously about how they would refute or counter that. There's no one who occupies that position today. And what's happened, ironically, and what we're doing right now through the magic of Zoom, is we've gone from 3 networks to the chaos of social media, where it's a kind of free-for-all, anything goes. And I know you're a journalist. What's gone is the editorial function. Now, some people will say, well, the gatekeeper's gone. Yes, editors are gatekeepers. And over time, you can figure out if they're trustworthy or untrustworthy gatekeepers. You'll figure out their biases. But the editorial function, where an editor tells you, what's your facts? How do you back that up? So to use an example that's somewhat cliched, but most of the people in the audience will be completely familiar with it, if not from having lived through it, from having seen the Hoffman and Redford version of All the President's Men, where Jason Robards, as Ben Bradley, keeps telling them, where's your facts? Where do you back that up? What's your evidence? What's your source? I mean, if I'm going to publish that, how do I defend it? How can I? What happens in social media is that's gone. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg has resisted it. I believe his name is John Dorsey, the guy at Twitter, made a small attempt to exercise what I would call editorial discretion by fact-checking a recent presidential tweet, and all hell rained down on his head. How dare he? And so what's gone, that's a big difference, the loss of an editorial function, because now you have, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said it best, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. But when you have everyone going on and on and on, and no one cross-checking and validating, triangulate, whatever verb you want to use, actually that's a participle, but however you want to do that, so you now have an information free-for-all.
Well, I think that that's one of the more interesting developments just happening in the now is like you said on Twitter, when Jack Dorsey says, okay, I'm going to now put a, little blurb here to, point to the right facts, to say there's not enough information. And the person that he's fact checking happens to be, largely we'd agree the most powerful position in the free world, the president of the United States. And so it's so interesting to see that. But one of the things that you do in your presentations for 1968 that I have always found refreshing, I guess, to give someone like me who didn't live through 1968 context for that it's not all Pollyannish when it comes to the media, because you show a great clip, and here we can just talk about it, between Gore Vidal and William Buckley, and going back and forth and the sparring that occurs there. So it's not as if everyone got along and they were holding hands and singing Kumbaya. There was vitriol at that point.
There was a lot of vitriol. In fact, every cable, I think I made the comment in those presentations, every cable news talking head owes their career to William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal. And when they covered the Democratic conventions, they were on ABC. ABC had the smallest budget, the smallest number of people. They couldn't compete with NBC and CBS's ability to cover the waterfront, so to speak. So they had to figure out what their niche would be. And what they figured out a niche would be is they took these two guys, Buckley, probably at that time, other than maybe Barry Goldwater, the most prominent conservative in American society, and Gore Vidal, who was a highly accomplished novelist. Actually, it might even be fair to say he's a great novelist. At least a couple of his books, two of his biographical novels, Burr and Lincoln, are superb. But in any event, to take these two guys and have them comment, well, the two of them couldn't stand each other, and it didn't take long before Gore Vidal was gay, and so you have William F. Buckley calling him a faggot, and you have Gore Vidal calling Buckley a Nazi, and Buckley saying, the only Nazi on this set's you, and you ever call me a Nazi again, I'll punch you in the mouth. And of course, Buckley was in the military and served in the European theater, I believe, in World War II. So as as a veteran, he took particular exception to that statement. And so, yeah, but what happened was nobody remembers what either of them said about anything. They remember the show. And that's perhaps the biggest point. News ceased being news in the journalistic sense. Would have been no surprise to Joseph Pulitzer, and anybody's ever read the New York World, or William Randolph Hearst. But there were a lot of people who forgot that, and they thought of the news as this very serious thing. You know, the New York Times, the first pass at history. And so what Buckley and Vidal turned it into show business, or showed that there's money to be made if you turn it into show business. Not that they intended to do that. It was an unintended consequence. You've got news now as show business, unapologetically. And that's a major, major shift. So that's important. And I'm looking at the clock here. The last thing that Jim pointed out that I think is really important, we've talked about it, is leadership. And leadership between 68 and today at the national level. We're blessed in Erie to have some very competent local leaders. I've been very impressed with how the county executive has conducted herself during the era of COVID-19, and impressed with Mayor Schember's attempts to be transparent and open, but yet restore some calm in our current situation. But nationally, it would be hard pressed to find someone to say what I just said about, to offer those compliments. Jim Fallows points out that in 1968, whether you agreed with them policy-wise, Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, even George Wallace as a governor, knew they were competent. They knew how to run things. They actually did know how to run things. So leadership is important in two regards. The leader has to actually know how to run things. Peter Drucker has a famous comment that managers know how to do things right and leaders know how to do the right thing. But as I've told students in the graduate courses that seminars I've conducted in leadership, well, it's true that many managers are poor leaders of their office, department, or whatever. I've never met an effective, successful leader who wasn't also a competent manager. They're not mutually exclusive. So if you look back at 68, they were all competent managers. If we look at the national scene today, be hard pressed to argue the managerial competence of trying to, I know the Jefferson has to be nonpartisan. I'm trying to walk a fine line here, but it'd be very hard to argue the managerial competence of the chief executive. The second thing that Jim points out, and again, not stealing his thunder, it's worth reading it to hear his take on it precisely, is the other thing that the leaders of 1968, for all of their contentiousness, fundamentally respected the system. Lyndon Johnson, when he knew or began to realize he was going to lose, on March 31st didn't resign from office, announced that he would not run for re-election. I believe his exact phrase was, he could be a very pompous guy. I shall not seek another term as your president, or something to that effect, is his exact words. And people have said, well, he only did that because he knew he would lose. He said he did it because there was so much that he had to deal with. There was so much going on in America, the war, civil unrest, this, that, or the other thing, that he had to dedicate all his energy to doing his job correctly.
Well,
was he being disingenuous? Perhaps, but I'm going to take him at his word that it was probably a little bit of both. And what's important about that, Johnson never reneged on that, even when during the Democratic convention, amidst all of the riots and everything, when there was very briefly the faint flicker of a possibility of a draft Johnson, because nobody really wanted Humphrey. And he passed on it. O'Donnell talks about it. He was tempted, but he passed on it. And even Richard Nixon, who the younger version of me would probably be very surprised at me complimenting Richard Nixon. But even Richard Nixon, he would game the system, he'd lie and cheat, but he somehow fundamentally understood the rules of the game, knew he was stretching, if not flat out breaking the rules of the game, But when he realized he was beaten, he didn't try to destroy the whole system and pull the whole house across. He did not do a Gotterdammerung. He didn't try to pull the whole house down with him. He just folded his hand and left. And again, trying not to be too partisan here, as I mentioned to you before we started recording this, I'm trying to think of a time in American history when people seriously asked if the incumbent president actually understood and respected the system, and would, if they ever lost, if they should have lose for re-election, would they in fact leave office? And the only time I can think of, and I may be missing something, there may be a big elephant in the room I'm missing, but the only time I can think of was, interestingly enough, the very first election when people wondered, would Washington turn over power to Adams? Because at that time in human history, the chief, as it were, didn't just leave. But other than that, and of course, Washington was very scrupulous, to say the least. So those are the things that I think are really interesting in that article.
Well, and one of the things, and one of the things I really enjoy a section in that, and you just touched on it, is Fallows' treatment of Johnson there, and reminding us that Johnson was a person who sought power and really wanted the office and really aspired for it, and once he had it, was able to step away. And as you unpacked with Richard Nixon, someone who could game the system, but ultimately, when he knew he was beat, walked away, resigned, and said enough, and opened the country to a healing process. And so something very different. And certainly, I think what complicates all of this is that here we are in 2020, 5 months in, with all of the things we already mentioned happening, and on top of that, it's a presidential election year, and so heightened awareness to politics, heightened awareness to what's going on, what leadership looks like, and how we want to move forward. Do we want another 4 years? Do we want an extended version of what we've seen and had already? Time will tell, and we'll see what comes of this. Andy, we're almost out of time. And so for anybody tuning in today, first I want to encourage them to go and read all of your book notes that we've got on the website. And then I want to encourage them to go read James Fallows' piece for The Atlantic, Is This the Worst Year in Modern American History? Comparing 2020 to 1968, offers disquieting lessons for the present. That's what we've been unpacking here today. That's over on the Atlantic's website. Andy, I want to turn it back to you and say, of all of the things we're talking about here, if folks are to take away one thing, maybe two things, maybe three at the most if they can carry them, what do you want them to walk away with on our conversation here today on 1968, comparing that to 2020?
Well, I think the most important thing is the last one we just touched on, is leadership. Leadership is everything. And you don't, as I said, one does not understand how valuable or important it is until you are in an organization, an institution, a nation, a state, a city in which it's absent, in which the person in charge is either managerially inept or disrespects and has no fundamental respect for the system itself, or perhaps, worst case scenario, both of those things. And in 1968, as we just alluded to, regardless of one's opinion ideologically of Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, George Wallace, Hubert Humphrey, they all realized that they were the president of all the people. Perhaps lukewarm, if not indifferent to some of the people, but they realized that they were the president of all of the people, and that the role, if you will, of president obligated them to at least give that symbolic service. And Richard Nixon, there's a famous incident, and the train stop is in Ohio. It's in northwestern Ohio, and I'm not pulling up the name of the little town, but there was a little girl, and in those days, they still did do whistle stop back of the train, not all the time. Sometimes it was highly symbolic because passenger trains by 1968 were getting rare. But there was a little girl with a sign, "Bring us together." And Nixon adopted that as a theme, and I believe, I'll need to double check this, I believe he picked it up as a major theme in his inaugural address, that he understood the role, he understood the obligations of the office. Now, Richard Nixon's a complicated, if not flawed guy, but he understood that. And so I think as we look at the people who might seek that office in 2020, do they understand the obligations of that office? The responsibilities that are, and behaviors that are expected of them. And the other thing is the unresolved issue of race in America, that some people thought the Obama presidency signaled a post-racial America. Well, we now know with pain, we've known it for the last 7-8 years, Obama knew it, that wasn't true. But we need to grapple with that. And I would end on a note of hope. Let us not forget that this society in which we're constantly questioning how voters could have made certain choices they've made in recent years, that we live in a society in which not once, but twice the American people elected an African-American president of the United States. And we can't forget that. And we need to figure out what chord it is in our rhetorical repertoire that can replay that particular tune.
What a hopeful note to end on. I appreciate that, Andy. And two, I can't help but think one of the things we skipped over here in this presentation, of course, is music and the role that that plays in your presentations. That's something we'll get to on another day with another presentation. So much to unpack about 1968 and 2020. We're only 5 months in, so you might be on the hook for another one of these. Let's come back and revisit. Is 1968 still the worst? Is it still the worst year? Is 2020 getting better? Is it getting worse? We'll come back and find out. But Dr. Andrew Roth, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this Jefferson.
My pleasure to be with you.
Thank you to all of you joining and watching along at home. Thank you for tuning in. Again, friendly reminder to read James Fallows' Is This the Worst Year in Modern American History? Comparing 2020 to 1968 offers some disquieting lessons for the present. Head over to the Atlantic's website at www.theatlantic.com to read all of Andrew Roth's book notes. Head over to our website, the Jefferson's website, at www.jeserie.org. Over there, you'll also find out more about both upcoming and past Jefferson programs. We've got videos of the programs we've already had. We've got announcements of programs coming up. And you'll find a whole cache of publications that we've been putting out in addition to those book notes. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Mediating America. We appreciate your follows and your likes. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Svagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us today.